She shoved her little sister behind her back and looked the auctioneer dead in the eye. "Take me," Clara said. Her voice didn't shake. "Leave her. She's only 4. She won't survive a work farm." The crowd went quiet. Victor Holt smiled like a man who had just won something. And in the back of that frozen Wyoming crowd, a man nobody knew, a man who hadn't spoken to another human being in nearly 2 years, set down his coffee and started walking forward. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The auction block was a wagon bed turned on its side, propped up with fence posts someone had dragged out from behind the feed store. It wasn't built for dignity. It wasn't meant to be. Clara Mae Briggs was 10 years old, and she had been standing on that wagon bed for 11 minutes in the January cold of Harlow Creek, Wyoming, 1878, when she made the decision that would change everything. There were 5 of them up there. She had counted herself the same way she counted every night in the dormitory at Holt Home for Children, not out of habit, but out of necessity. If you didn't count, you didn't know who was missing. And missing in Victor Holt's establishment meant something nobody wanted to think about too hard. To her left stood her sister Abby, 4 years old. Born with one leg shorter than the other, a fact that the doctor in Cheyenne had said was fixable with the right shoes and the right care, and that Victor Holt had called a liability every single time a prospective family came through the door. Abby stood with her weight shifted to her right side. Her small hand locked around Clara's fingers so tight it had gone numb 20 minutes ago. Clara hadn't said a word about it. To Clara's right stood Thomas. He was 12, all angles and fury jaw set, like a man 3 times his age, fists curled at his sides. Thomas had been at Holt Home the longest of all of them. 4 years. Long enough to know that trust was a language other people spoke, and that the adults in charge of your life were not as a rule on your side. He hadn't spoken since they'd been loaded onto the wagon that morning. He hadn't needed to. His silence said everything. Behind Thomas stood Nora, 8 years old with eyes that were too old for her face, and a slate she carried everywhere, a piece of chalk worn down to a nub tucked into her coat pocket. Nora didn't speak. Not because she couldn't. The doctor had confirmed that her throat was fine, her hearing was fine, everything was physiologically fine. She had simply chosen at some point in the last 2 years that words were not worth the effort when a person could write what mattered and leave the rest alone. Victor Holt called her slow. People who paid attention knew she was the sharpest one in any room she'd ever entered, and at the far end of the line, pressed as close to the edge of the wagon as he could get without falling off, stood Eli, 6 years old, Clara's brother. Eli had not spoken in 7 months. He'd been a talker before that, a question every 5 minutes name, every bird in the sky, wake-up singing kind of child. Then came the night the farmhouse burned. Their parents were inside. Eli had watched from the yard, Clara's arms locked around him from behind her hand pressed over his eyes, because she hadn't wanted him to see. But children feel what they can't see. He'd felt it all. And when the fire was finally out, and the neighbors came and someone tried to ask him what happened, Eli had opened his mouth and nothing had come out. That was 7 months ago. Not a word since. Not a sound. Clara looked at him now at the way he stood with his arms tight to his sides, staring at the ground, and she felt the same thing she always felt when she looked at him. A love so fierce, it sat in her chest like a burning coal, and a fear just as fierce beneath it. Victor Holt stepped up onto a crate beside the wagon, straightened his coat, and smiled at the assembled crowd of farmers, ranchers, shopkeepers, and curious bystanders who had gathered in the cold. "Good morning, folks," Holt said. He had a voice built for sermons, warm and round, and full of implied benevolence. "I know it's cold. I appreciate you all coming out. These are difficult circumstances, believe me. Nobody wants to see children in need. But the Lord's work is not always comfortable work, and finding productive placements for these young ones is the right and Christian thing to do." A farmer near the front scratched his jaw. "How old's the oldest one?" 10, Holt said. "Clara, strong girl, good worker. She can cook, she can clean, she manages the younger ones well. Her mother was a school teacher, so she reads above her level. Starting bid is $12. What about the little one? A woman's voice somewhere in the middle of the crowd. The one favoring her leg. Holt's expression did something complicated, concern performing over calculation. That's Abby, 4 years old. The leg is a congenital issue. Nothing contagious, nothing that affects her mind. She's a sweet child, manageable. I'd place her in a gentle household. Starting bid $8. $8 for a crippled child? A man laughed. Not cruelly, just practically the way a man laughs at a bad deal. Holt kept his smile intact. She'll grow out of the limp with proper care. Or she won't, the man said, and shrugged. Clara felt Abby's hand tighten further. She glanced down, and Abby was looking at her. Those 4-year-old eyes asking a question that no 4-year-old should ever have to ask, which was whether anyone in this crowd was going to want her. She'll go with me, Clara said quietly to Abby, not to the crowd. Wherever I go, you go. I promised. Abby nodded. She believed Clara. That was the thing about Abby, she still believed promises. She hadn't lived long enough to learn better, and Clara was going to fight with everything she had to make sure that remained true. Holt moved down the line. Thomas, 12 years old. Strong back, good with livestock, experienced in barn work. He has some behavioral history, but nothing that firm guidance won't correct. Thomas's jaw tightened at the word behavioral. He said nothing. Starting bid $15. The boy can earn his keep inside a season. A rancher near the back nodded. I'll take a look at him. Nora. Holt gestured toward the girl with the slate. 8 years old. Quiet, very quiet. She communicates by writing. Nothing wrong with her mind, she's clever enough. Useful in a household that doesn't require a lot of conversation. He paused, letting that land as a small joke. Nobody laughed. Starting bid $8. Then Holt reached Eli. He looked at the boy for a moment with an expression that Clara had learned to read over 7 months of living under his roof. It was the expression of a man calculating how to present an unprofitable item. This is Eli, Holt said. Clara's brother, 6 years old. He is... Another pause, selectively mute. Has not spoken since a traumatic incident 7 months ago. Healthy otherwise. Starting bid $6. The crowd murmured. $6 for a mute child. The same farmer who'd questioned Abby said. What use is that on a farm? He responds to instruction, Holt said. He understands everything you say. He just doesn't answer. I don't need a child who doesn't answer, a woman said flatly. I need help, not a liability. The murmuring spread. Clara watched it move through the crowd like a cold wind, watched the faces shift from curious to calculating to dismissive, and she understood with the clarity of a 10-year-old who had survived things that would break most adults exactly what was about to happen. They were going to bid on her. Probably on Thomas. Maybe on Nora. Nobody was going to bid on Abby. Nobody was going to bid on Eli. And Holt, who had no patience for children that couldn't be placed at profit, was going to do what he always threatened when a child proved inconvenient. He was going to send them somewhere worse. He had said it enough times that the children at Holt home had stopped asking what worse meant. The not knowing was its own kind of terror. Clara looked at her brother. Then she looked at her sister. Then she made a decision. Take her, Clara said. Her voice cut through the crowd noise cleanly. Holt turned to look at her. The crowd quieted. I beg your pardon, Holt said. Clara stepped forward on the wagon bed. Take her instead of me. She was looking at the rancher in the back who had nodded at Thomas, the one who looked like he might actually provide 3 meals a day and a real roof. Abby, she's small. She won't eat much. Her leg doesn't hurt her much in warm weather. She's good with animals. She's gentle. Take her. Holt's voice went flat. Clara, that is not how this works. Take her instead of me, Clara repeated louder. Please. She's 4 years old and nobody's going to want her because of her leg, and she's my sister, and she can't go somewhere bad. She won't survive it. I will. She pressed her lips together for exactly 1 second, then continued. I'm 10. I can work. I can manage. She can't. So take her. Put me back in the home. Send her somewhere decent." The crowd had gone very still. Abby made a sound. Not words, just a sharp little intake of breath, and tried to grab Clara's hand again. Clara didn't let her. She kept her hands at her sides and kept her eyes on the crowd, because if she looked at Abby, she was going to fall apart, and falling apart was a luxury she could not afford. Holt stepped closer to Clara, lowering his voice to something the crowd couldn't quite hear. "You will stop speaking right now." "Or what?" Clara said, not lowering her voice at all. Holt's hand moved. It was fast, the kind of fast that came from practice from years of correcting children who forgot their place. His palm connected with the side of Clara's head hard enough to rock her sideways. The crowd made a sound, a collective intake of breath, but nobody moved. Physical discipline of orphans was not in 1878, Wyoming, a matter the law concerned itself with particularly. Clara didn't fall. She planted her feet, blinked twice, and straightened. She did not cry. She turned back to the crowd with red blooming along her cheekbone and said, "Someone take my sister, please. I'm asking. Someone just take her somewhere decent." In the back of the crowd, a man who had been standing very still for the last several minutes set down the coffee cup he'd been holding. His name was James Calloway. He was 36 years old, though he looked older in the way that men who have lived outside for too long and lost something important tend to look older than their years. He had a rancher's build broad through the shoulders, weathered hands, a jaw that suggested he'd made a habit of clenching it. His coat was old but clean. His boots were muddy from the morning ride into town. His eyes were gray, and they had been watching the wagon since before Holt climbed up on his crate, and they had been watching Clara specifically for the last 3 minutes. He had come to Harlow Creek to buy grain. He had not come to buy anything else. He had not spoken to another person in a meaningful way in almost 2 years, not since the fever took Margaret in the spring of 1876 and left him alone on 400 acres, with nothing but the sound of wind through grass and the particular silence of a house that used to have someone in it. He worked the ranch because the alternative was lying down and not getting up, and some stubborn, unreasonable part of him had refused to do that. He hadn't known what he was waiting for. He had stopped believing he was waiting for anything. He watched this 10-year-old girl take a strike to the face and stand back up and keep speaking on behalf of her sister, and something moved in his chest that he did not immediately have a name for. Then Eli silent, 7-month mute. Eli made a sound. It was not a word. It was a single high-breaking note of distress, the sound a child makes when the thing they feared most begins to take shape in the world. Clara turned to him, immediately dropped to one knee on the wagon bed, and grabbed his face in both her hands. "Look at me," she said. "Look at me, Eli. I'm right here. I'm not leaving you. Look at me." The boy looked at her. His mouth was open. Nothing came out but that terrible, soundless grief. "I need you to be brave," Clara told him, her voice dropping to something just between them. "Can you do that for me? Can you be brave?" Eli's chin trembled. He nodded once. Clara pressed her forehead against his for exactly 3 seconds. Then she stood back up and turned to face the crowd, and her expression was something that James Calloway had not seen on a child's face in his life, and hoped never to see again, the expression of someone who has run completely out of options and made peace with the consequences. $50, James said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. He hadn't used it much lately. Every head in the crowd turned. Holt stared at him. "I beg your pardon?" James walked forward. He was already reaching into his coat, already counting the bills. He had come to buy grain. He had more than $50 on him. He wasn't entirely sure what he was doing, but his hands seemed to have figured it out before his mind caught up. $50, he said again, reaching the front of the crowd. For all 5. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. "Sir," Holt said slowly, "these are individual placements. You don't need to—" "I know what I need." James held out the bills. $50, all 5 children, right now. You give me the papers, I give you the money, and we're done before lunch." A ripple went through the crowd. Someone laughed, nervous and confused. A woman whispered something to her husband. The rancher, who had been considering Thomas, turned to look at James with the expression of a man trying to determine whether he was witnessing generosity or lunacy. Holt looked at the money. His eyes went through a rapid calculation that his composed expression almost concealed. "You understand," Holt said carefully, "that these children come with considerable challenges. The boy doesn't speak. The youngest has a deformity. The 12-year-old has a history of behavioral—" "I heard what you said." James looked at Thomas, then at Nora, at Abby, at Eli, finally at Clara, who was watching him with the wariest eyes he'd seen on any creature in his life. "I heard every word you said about all of them. I'm still offering $50. "Why?" Clara asked. The word came out before she could stop it. Just one word, flat and honest, and entirely without the gratitude that adults generally expected from children in her position. James looked at her. He thought about Margaret, about the way she used to sit on the porch in the evening and say, "Someday, James, we're going to fill this house." He thought about 400 acres of silence. He thought about the particular sound a door makes when there's no one on the other side of it. "Because you were willing to give yourself up for your sister," he said, "and I haven't seen that kind of courage in a long time." Clara studied him the way a child who has been betrayed by adults studies every adult who claims to mean well. Her gaze moved across his face, methodical and unsentimental, taking inventory. "We stay together," she said. "All 5 of us. That's what I'm paying for. And if you change your mind later, if one of us is too much trouble, if Eli doesn't talk and it makes you nervous, or Abby's leg slows things down, or Thomas is too angry, or Nora won't answer when you speak to her." James looked at each child in turn. "Then I figure it out," he said. "That's what adults are supposed to do." Clara's jaw shifted. Something moved behind her eyes. Not trust, not yet, not even close to trust, but the very first, most reluctant acknowledgement that the man in front of her had not yet said the wrong thing. She looked at Eli. Eli was looking at James. His small face was unreadable, but he had stopped making that high breaking sound. He stood very still, the way a wild animal stands still when it's trying to determine whether the thing in front of it is a threat. Clara looked back at James. "Okay," she said. It was not a warm word. It was not a grateful word. It was the word of a person accepting terms under duress while reserving the right to reconsider. But it was enough. Holt, who had been calculating through this entire exchange, extended his hand with the smile of a man who had made more money than he expected before noon. "We have an agreement, Mr. Calloway, James Calloway. The papers, Mr. Calloway. Sign here, and these children are your responsibility." James signed. The money changed hands. The papers went into his coat. He turned to the 5 children on the wagon. "Come on," he said. "Wagon's over there." Nobody moved. Thomas's voice was the first one, low and hostile. "Where are you taking us?" "My ranch, north of town, about an hour's ride." "And then what?" "And then I figure out how to feed 5 children," James said. "I haven't gotten much further than that." Thomas stared at him. "That's not reassuring." "No," James agreed. "It isn't." Something shifted in Thomas's face, a barely perceptible crack in the hard shell of it there, and gone in less than a second. He jumped down from the wagon without another word, landed in the snow, and walked toward where James had indicated the wagon was parked. It was not enthusiasm. It was not trust. It was a 12-year-old boy who had learned that standing still in bad situations only made them worse. Nora climbed down next slate, clutched to her chest. She paused beside James and looked up at him. Then she wrote something on the slate and held it up. It read, "Do you have books?" "Some," James said. "Not many. We can get more." Nora considered this. Then she nodded once and followed Thomas. Abby couldn't get down from the wagon on her own. Clara jumped down first, then reached back up. James watched Clara position herself carefully, accounting for the angle, accounting for Abby's weak side, talking her sister through every step in a low, steady voice. "There you go, one at a time. Hold my shoulder, not my arm. Good. Good, Abby. You've got it." Abby landed in the snow and grabbed Clara's hand with both of hers. She looked up at James with eyes the color of winter sky. "Do you have a dog?" Abby asked. "No," James said. Abby's expression went briefly tragic. Then she rallied. "We could get one." "Maybe," James said. "We'll see." Abby accepted this with the diplomacy of a child who understood that maybe was better than no. The last one was Eli. He sat on the edge of the wagon bed, feet dangling, and looked at James with eyes that had not looked at any adult man with anything other than fear in 7 months. James did not reach for him. He did not hold out his hand. He simply stood where he was and waited, because something about the boy told him that being grabbed even gently was not going to help anything. A long moment passed. Then Eli looked at Clara. Clara nodded. Eli slid off the wagon and landed in the snow and immediately pressed himself against his sister's side, one fist curling into the fabric of her coat. He did not look at James again. But he had come down. That was something. They walked to the wagon. All 5 children climbed in. James threw blankets over them. Old blankets worn soft with use but clean. There was room for all of them, and none of the crowded, cold misery of the Holt home dormitory, where 12 children shared a space built for 8. And every morning you woke up to someone else's breath on your face and the smell of other people's fear. As James climbed to the driver's bench, he heard Clara's voice from behind him, low and meant for her siblings. "Keep your eyes open," she was saying. "Watch where we go. Count the landmarks. You remember everything." Thomas's voice equally low. "You think we'll need to run?" A pause. "I think we should know how," Clara said. James did not turn around. He clicked his tongue at the horses and started them moving, and the wagon rolled out of Harlow Creek through the cold January morning, and he sat with those words in his chest. I think we should know how, and understood that he had 5 children behind him who had been failed so thoroughly and so consistently by adults that their primary response to an act of kindness was to plan their escape route. He could not blame them for that. He could only drive. The ranch appeared after an hour of silent travel through snow-covered flatlands and bare-limbed cottonwoods. The house was 2 stories wood frame with a wide porch and a chimney putting out smoke, because James had banked the fire before he left that morning. The barn was solid. The fences were maintained. It was a working ranch, not a pretty one, but it was real, and it was warm, and it was standing. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. Nobody got out. James climbed down and turned to look at them. 5 children in a wagon buried under old blankets, watching him with the collective wariness of animals that have been trapped before and have learned what open doors look like right before they close. "This is it," he said. "Come inside. There's a fire." Clara's eyes moved across the house. The porch, the barn, the fields, the distances between things. "You live alone?" she asked. "Yes." "Since when?" "Almost 2 years." Why? He could have told her it was none of her business. He could have told her children didn't ask questions like that. He said, "My wife died, fever." Clara held his gaze for a moment. Then she climbed out of the wagon, helped Abby down, and turned to the house. "Eli," she said quietly. "Come on." Eli came. They all came. And James Calloway stood in the cold Wyoming air and watched 5 children file into his house, into the silence he'd been living in for 2 years, into the space that Margaret used to fill with her voice, and her plans, and her particular way of making a room feel inhabited rather than just occupied. He stood there long enough that Thomas appeared in the doorway and looked at him with those ancient, suspicious eyes. "You coming in?" Thomas said. "Yeah," James said. "Yeah, I am." He walked up the porch steps and went inside, and he pulled the door closed behind him, and the sound it made was different than it had made in 2 years. Less like an ending. More like something else. He didn't have a word for it yet, but it was there. The first morning came the way first mornings in unfamiliar places. Always due too early, too quiet, and full of the particular disorientation of waking up and not knowing for one suspended second where you are or whether you are safe. Clara knew where she was before she opened her eyes. She had catalogued the room the night before. 2 windows. 1 door, the distance from the bed to the hallway. The creak in the 3rd floorboard from the left. She had done this in every new place for the last 8 months. Knowledge was the only currency that couldn't be taken from you. She lay still and listened. Downstairs, something was burning. She was on her feet before she'd made the conscious decision to move one hand on Abby's shoulder, still sleeping, breathing slow, and even before she caught the smell properly. Not the sharp, catastrophic smell of a structure fire. The smaller, more domestic smell of something in a pan left too long over heat. She went downstairs. James Calloway was standing over the cast-iron stove with the expression of a man engaged in a losing battle with a substance that had until recently been batter. 3 blackened discs sat on a plate to his left. A fourth was actively producing smoke in the pan. He was staring at it with the focused intensity of someone who believed that if he looked hard enough, the situation might improve on its own. It did not improve. "You could turn the heat down," Clara said from the doorway. James looked up. Something moved across his face. Not surprise, exactly more like a man who had forgotten that other people existed in his house and was recalibrating. "It's already down." "It doesn't look down." He looked back at the pan. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." Clara crossed the kitchen, moved him aside with a hand on his arm. Practical, not unkind, and adjusted the damper on the stove. The smoke thinned. She took the pan off the direct heat, waited 30 seconds, put it back. The next pour of batter settled into something that looked closer to an actual pancake than the carbonized experiments on the plate. "My mother taught me," Clara said. When he didn't respond, she added, "She was a good cook, before." "Before the fire," James said. "Yes." They stood in the kitchen and let that sit between them without trying to fix it, which was more than most adults managed. By the time the others came downstairs, Thomas first, then Nora, then Abby, limping carefully on the stairs and refusing help. Then Eli pressed so close to Clara's side he was practically attached. There was a stack of pancakes on the table and bacon that was more crisp than ideal, but edible. James had made coffee. He did not offer the children because he had some instincts intact. They sat, they ate. Thomas ate like someone who had internalized at a cellular level the lesson that food was temporary and abundance was a lie. 4 pancakes, 5 strips of bacon, and then he stopped moving, and Clara watched his face go through something she recognized, the specific bewildering shock of fullness of a stomach that had been told it would always be empty, discovering that the premise was wrong. His eyes went bright and hard, and he turned his face toward the window and his jaw worked. "You can have more," James said. Thomas didn't answer. "There's no limit," James continued in the same even tone. "You eat until you're done. That's the only rule at this table." "What are the other rules?" Clara asked. James thought about it. "I'm still working them out." "That's not reassuring either," Thomas said, still looking at the window, his voice rough. "No," James agreed. "I keep hearing that." Nora had her slate out. She pushed it across the table toward James. It read, "What do we call you?" James looked at it for a moment. "Calloway's fine. Or James. Whatever you're comfortable with." Nora wrote again, "Not Papa." "No," James said. "Not that. Not unless—" He stopped. "No, Calloway's fine." Nora nodded and retrieved her slate. Abby, who had been eating steadily and seriously in the way of 4-year-olds who treat every meal as a professional obligation, looked up. "I want to see the barn." "After breakfast," James said. "Is there a horse?" 6. Abby's eyes went enormous. 6 horses. I run cattle. You need horses. Can I touch one? If it lets you. Abby processed this. What if it doesn't let me? Then you respect that and try again tomorrow. She considered this philosophy, found it acceptable, and returned to her pancakes. Eli ate nothing. He sat with his hands in his lap and his eyes on the table, and Clara quietly put food on his plate and did not comment on it, and after 20 minutes he had eaten half of it, which was more than he usually managed. James noticed. He didn't say anything about it. Clara noticed that he noticed and didn't say anything and filed it. After breakfast, James showed them the ranch. Not as a tour. He wasn't a man who narrated things, but practically because they needed to know where things were and what needed doing. The barn, the chicken coop, the woodpile, the well. The workshop attached to the east side of the barn, where tools hung in rows, and a workbench held a half-finished something under a cloth. Thomas stopped at the workshop door and looked at the tools with an expression that Clara couldn't quite read. Not hunger exactly. Recognition, maybe. The look of someone seeing a language they half speak. "You make things?" Thomas asked. "Fix things mostly," James said. "Make what I can't buy." Thomas's eyes moved to the cloth-covered project. "What's that?" James lifted the cloth. Underneath was a small rocking chair, half assembled, the joints cut but not yet fitted. "Was making it for..." He paused. "I started it a while ago. Haven't finished." "For your wife," Clara said. James lowered the cloth. "Yes." The word sat there flat and honest, and nobody tried to put anything comforting around it. Inside the barn, Abby made her way down the row of stalls, with the single-minded determination of a child who has located something she considers her personal responsibility. The horses watched her with the mild curiosity of animals that have seen stranger things. She stopped at the third stall, a brown mare with a white star on her forehead, and stood very still with her hand flat against the stall door. "She smells like outside," Abby said. "Horses tend to," James said. "I like it." Abby didn't look away from the mare. "What's her name?" "Doesn't have one. I don't name the working horses." Abby turned to look at him with an expression of profound moral objection. "That's wrong." "Abby," Clara said. "It is," Abby insisted, turning back to the mare. "Everything needs a name. Otherwise, how does it know you're talking to it?" She pressed her palm flat to the stall door. The mare lowered her head and sniffed at her fingers. "Her name is June." James opened his mouth, appeared to reconsider, and closed it. "All right," he said. "You're not going to argue," Thomas said, sounding faintly surprised. "She's not wrong," James said. "The horse does need to know you're talking to it." Thomas looked at him sideways. Clara watched this exchange and added it to the running count. She was keeping the things James Calloway did and did not do, the places where he behaved like adults were supposed to behave, and the places where he behaved like something else. Something she didn't have a category for yet. He did not raise his voice. He did not make promises he followed immediately with conditions. He did not look at Eli with the particular mixture of pity and impatience that most adults used on children who didn't perform the way they were supposed to. She had been watching for all of it. She was still watching. On the third day she found the bread. She was up before anyone else, doing what she always did, which was a room-by-room accounting of the house and everyone in it, when she passed the boys' room and saw Thomas's mattress shifted at an angle it hadn't been in before. She lifted the edge. A loaf of bread, still mostly intact, slightly stale, tucked into a cloth. She pushed the mattress back and said nothing. That evening, when Thomas came downstairs for supper, James was already at the stove. He said without turning around, "Pantry's unlocked. Always will be." Thomas stopped walking. "I didn't." "I know." "I wasn't going to eat it. I just wanted it there." "I know that too." James put a plate on the table. "Take whatever you need to take. That's not a rule I'll change." Thomas stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at this man with an expression Clara had never seen on his face before, which was the expression of someone who has braced for an impact that doesn't come and doesn't know what to do with the absence of it. "You should be angry," Thomas said. "Why?" "Because I stole from you. You hid bread because you've been hungry long enough that food security is a survival instinct." James turned around. "That's not theft. That's damage. There's a difference." Thomas stared at him. "What's the difference?" "Theft is a choice. Damage is what happens to people when the world treats them wrong. I'm not going to punish you for damage that isn't yours." Thomas sat down at the table. He didn't say anything else. But he sat and he ate. And that night Clara heard him sleep through until morning for the first time, without waking up at 2 in the morning, like he always did, with the reflexive panic of someone who has internalized that nighttime is when things go wrong. It was on the 5th day that James came home from the workshop with something under his arm wrapped in cloth. He set it on the table in front of Abby without preamble. She unwrapped it. They were shoes. Not fancy shoes, not store-bought shoes, but shoes constructed with evident care. The right one. Ordinary, the left one built up along the sole with layered leather. The differential calculated with a precision that spoke of someone who had measured and remeasured, and thought hard about the geometry of a 4-year-old's gait. Abby looked at them, then she looked at James. "Put them on," Clara said softly. Abby put them on. She stood. She took a step. The familiar lurch to her right that she'd been compensating for since she'd learned to walk was not gone, but reduced. Measurably, visibly reduced. She took another step, and then she ran. Actually ran across the kitchen floor, and she laughed a sound so surprised and full and unguarded that it made Clara press the back of her hand against her mouth. Abby ran back to James and threw her arms around his waist and held on her face buried in his coat. James went very still. The way a man goes still when he's afraid that moving will disturb something fragile. His hands came up and rested on her shoulders carefully, the way you touch something you aren't sure you've earned the right to touch. "They hurt?" he asked. Abby shook her head against his coat. "I can adjust them if they hurt." Another headshake. Clara watched her little sister cling to this man she had known for 5 days, and she felt something move in her chest, slow and resistant, like ice in early spring, that knows it's losing but hasn't given up yet. She pressed it back down. She was good at pressing things down. But she watched. Eli watched too. He had been watching James all week with that still animal attention, standing at the edges of rooms, tracking the man's movements, cataloging everything. James had not pushed him, had not addressed him directly more than a handful of times, had not tried to coax him into speaking, or suggested that his silence was a problem that needed solving. He simply moved through the house and the ranch, and if Eli happened to be nearby, he talked about what he was doing, not to Eli, exactly, just out loud, the way a person talks to themselves when they're working, and Eli listened without being required to respond. On the 6th evening, James sat by the fire after supper and worked on mending a piece of harness, and Eli sat down 3 feet away from him and watched his hands. James kept working. He said, "You can ask me anything you want. You don't have to talk to ask. Nora figured that out, she just writes it down." Eli looked at his own hands. "You don't have to do anything," James said. "I just want you to know the option exists." A long silence. Then Eli reached out and touched the piece of harness James was working on. Just one finger pressing against the leather to test its texture. James held it toward him so he could feel the whole piece. Eli took it in both hands and turned it over, examining it with the focused attention of a child who once asked questions about everything and still has all those questions stored up somewhere waiting. Clara from across the room felt the ice move again. She went to bed before she let herself think too much about what it meant. On the 8th day, the letter arrived. It came with the weekly mail delivery in an envelope with a Virginia City return address and a seal that Clara didn't recognize. She saw it before James did. She had been sweeping the porch when the rider came through, and she brought it inside and set it on the table. James read it standing up. His face did not change much while he read. Clara had been watching his face carefully for 8 days, and she had learned its terrain. The slight tension at the jaw that meant something required thought, the almost imperceptible narrowing at the eyes that meant he disagreed with something, but was deciding whether to say so. Both of those things happened while he read the letter. Then he folded it, put it in his coat pocket, and looked up. Clara was watching him from the kitchen doorway. "Who was it from?" she asked. James held her gaze. She appreciated that he didn't look away, didn't do the adult thing of deciding she was too young for the truth. "Holt's lawyer," he said. Clara's stomach dropped 4 inches. "What does he want?" "He's claiming the auction was a labor contract, not a custody transfer. He says you're still legal wards of Holt home." James paused. He wants you back. The kitchen went silent. Thomas, who had been at the table with Nora, stood up so fast his chair scraped back against the floor. No. Sit down, Thomas. No, I will not. I am not going back there. You can't make me go back there. I'm not making you do anything. James's voice was steady. Sit down, so I can think. Thomas sat. His jaw was rigid, his hands flat on the table, the knuckles bloodless. Nora wrote on her slate and pushed it to the center of the table so everyone could read it. It said what happens now. I go to town, James said. I talk to Sheriff Hardin. I find out what the law says and what our options are. He looked around the table at Thomas's fury, at Nora's watchful stillness, at Abby, who had understood enough to have gone very quiet, at Eli, who had pressed himself against Clara's side. Then he looked at Clara. I made you a promise, he said. 8 days ago. I don't break promises. Clara looked at him. You don't know us, she said. It came out quieter than she intended. You've known us 8 days. Holt has lawyers. You're one man. Why would you fight for people you don't know well enough to fight for? James was quiet for a moment. Because I know you well enough, he said. I know Abby named a horse in the first 20 minutes. I know Thomas sleeps with bread under his mattress. I know Nora reads faster than I do, and she's been through every book in this house and is going to need more. I know Eli sat next to me for an hour last night and never once flinched away. He paused. And I know you check on all of them twice every night because you've been the only reliable thing in their lives, and you're not ready to trust that there might be someone else who takes that job seriously. Clara's throat tightened. Am I wrong? James asked. She shook her head once. Then let me go to town, he said. Let me find out what we're dealing with, and when I come back, I'll tell you the truth, all of it, whatever it is. I won't protect you from bad news. You're too smart for that, and you've earned better. Clara looked at her brother, at his small hands, at the way he was watching James with those eyes that had been silent for 7 months, and still held every word he'd never been able to say. Okay, she said. It was the same word she'd said in the snow outside Holt home 8 days ago, when a stranger had offered $50 and an unknown future. But this time it sounded different. This time there was something in it that hadn't been there before. Not trust. Not yet. But the very beginning of belief that trust might eventually be possible. James saddled his horse before noon and rode for Harlow Creek, and Clara stood on the porch and watched him go, and did not let herself think about what happened if he didn't come back with good news, because she had learned a long time ago that you could not afford to spend your strength on outcomes you could not control. She went back inside. She had children to take care of. That was the thing that had always been true, and the only thing she knew for certain would remain true, no matter what the lawyer said. Sheriff Roy Hardin was a man who had held his position in Harlow Creek for 14 years by mastering the art of telling people things they didn't want to hear without making them feel like he was enjoying it. He was good at that. He was less good, James discovered, at offering solutions to go along with the unwelcome information. He's got a case, Hardin said, setting the letter on his desk after reading it twice. I don't like it, but he's got one. Explain it to me. The auction bill of sale. Hardin leaned back in his chair. Way Holt's lawyer reads it, you purchased labor rights. Temporary custodial arrangement for the purpose of work placement. Not adoption. Not guardianship. The territory never transferred legal wardship. I paid $50 for 5 children, James said. What did Holt think I was buying? Holt thought exactly what his lawyer is now arguing and writing. That's the problem. Hardin picked up the letter again. He's requesting their return within 10 days. After that, he files with the territorial court. And if he files, then a judge looks at it, and a judge looking at the paperwork alone is going to have a hard time ruling against a licensed institution of 20 years standing in favor of a rancher who bypassed every legal channel for child placement. Hardin met his eyes. I'm not saying it's right, James. I'm saying that's what the paper looks like. James sat with that for a moment. Who's the circuit judge? Morrison. He comes through in 12 days. 12 days, which means if Holt files immediately, you and Morrison are going to be meeting at approximately the same time. Hardin folded the letter. You need witnesses, people who can speak to your fitness and to the conditions at Holt home. You need documentation, and you need the children to be able to speak for themselves if it comes to that. Clara will speak for herself, James said. I'm not worried about that. I know you're not. I've heard about her. Hardin almost smiled. Word gets around in a town this size. The girl who offered herself at auction to save her sister. He paused. That kind of thing doesn't stay quiet. James rode back to the ranch in the early afternoon. He told them everything the same way he'd promised, all of it straight, without softening the edges. Thomas put his fist through the wall beside the fireplace. Not hard enough to do real damage. Just hard enough to put a dent in the plaster and split the skin over 2 knuckles. He stood with his forehead against the wall afterward, breathing in the controlled way of someone managing something that wants very badly to be unmanageable. Thomas, James said, don't. Thomas's voice was muffled against the wall. Just don't say it's going to be fine. Don't say you'll figure it out. I've heard that from every adult I've ever known, and it has never once been true. I wasn't going to say either of those things. Thomas turned around. His eyes were red at the edges. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was fighting himself. Then what were you going to say? That I know you're angry. That you have every right to be. And that I need you to hold on to it for 12 days. And then you can do whatever you want with it. But right now I need you thinking clearly, not bleeding on my floor. Thomas looked at his hand. The knuckles were seeping. He sat down. Clara got a cloth from the kitchen without being asked, brought it to Thomas, pressed it against his hand. He let her. That was how far they had come in 8 days, Thomas letting someone take care of him without making it a negotiation. Nora wrote on her slate and held it up toward James. It read, "What do we have to do?" "We have to show the judge that you're better off here than at Holt home," James said. "We have to prove it, not just say it." Nora wrote again, "How do you prove something that's true?" James looked at her. "You find people who saw it. You find evidence. And you tell the truth as clearly as you can, and you hope the person listening is the kind of person who can recognize it." Abby, sitting on the floor with her new shoes on, as she always did, now looked up. "What if they're not?" "Then we try something else," James said. "But we start with the truth." The next morning, James took them to town. Not for the hearing that was still 10 days away, but for what Hardin had suggested. To be seen. To become real to the people of Harlow Creek as children and not as abstractions in a legal filing. They walked down the main street together. James in front, and people looked the way people in small towns always look at something that doesn't fit their existing categories with curiosity that hadn't decided yet whether it was friendly or hostile. The first stop was Dr. Emmett Greer's office. Greer was 61 years old, had been practicing medicine in Harlow Creek for 25 years, and had a reputation for blunt honesty that made him either the best or worst person to have as a witness, depending entirely on what the truth happened to be. He examined each child in turn with a thoroughness that was clinical and entirely without condescension. He noted weights, checked teeth, and eyes documented what he found in a leather journal with a pen. He dipped precisely twice before each entry. When he got to the burn scars on Clara's right arm, he stopped. "How did this happen?" he said. It was not quite a question. Clara looked at James. He nodded. "Holt held my arm against the stove," she said. "I told him the food wasn't enough for the little ones. He said I was being insolent." Greer wrote for 30 seconds without speaking. Then he looked at her. "Did you report it to anyone?" "Who would I report it to?" He owned the building. The territory paid him. The sheriff came once a month, and Holt showed him the clean dormitory and the full kitchen, not the room where we actually slept. "The room where you actually slept," Greer repeated. 12 children in a space for 8. Floor in winter. 3 blankets between us." Greer wrote more. He examined Thomas's old bruising faded now, but documented the particular yellow-green of injuries several weeks past, and Nora's underweight frame, and Eli's silence, which he noted with a specific clinical terminology that James didn't fully understand, but which sounded in its precision like something a judge would have to take seriously. When he finished, he sat at his desk and looked at James. "I've treated children from Holt home before," Greer said. "Broken bones attributed to falls. Burns attributed to kitchen accidents. Malnutrition attributed to finicky eating." He paused, each pause waited. "I documented all of it. I have 10 years of documentation." James felt something shift. "Would you testify to that?" "I'll testify to what I've observed and recorded," Greer said. "I've been waiting for a reason to for a long time. Holt has friends in this county. I didn't have a case strong enough to justify the fight." He looked at the children. "I may have one now." The second stop was the general store owned and operated by a woman named Helen Marsh, who had lived in Harlow Creek for 37 years, and whose opinions were by general consensus as reliable as any official record the county possessed. She was behind the counter when they came in, and she looked at James with the measuring expression of a woman who reserved judgment until she had sufficient data and then delivered it without apology. "You're the man who bought the auction children," she said. "I am," James said. "Why?" It was the same question Clara had asked him at the auction and again at the ranch, and he had given different versions of the answer each time. He gave her the plainest one. "Because nobody else was going to." Helen Marsh looked at each child in turn. Her gaze rested longest on Abby, specifically on her shoes, on the built-up left sole, on the visible craft of them on the way. Abby stood with her weight distributed evenly for the first time in her life. "Who made those?" Helen said. "I did," James said. Helen came out from behind the counter. She knelt in front of Abby. Not easily. Her knees were not young, but she did it and looked at the shoes properly. Then she looked up at Abby's face. "Do they help?" she asked. "I can run," Abby said. "I ran across the kitchen. I never ran before." Helen stood. She looked at James for a long, unreadable moment. Then she went to her shelves and began pulling fabric cotton wool, a bolt of something with a small print that was not strictly practical, and piled it on the counter. "You'll need this," she said. "Children grow. You'll need thread too. And buttons. And—" she added something else without explanation. "The little girls should have something that isn't entirely functional. That matters." James opened his mouth. Helen held up a hand. "Don't thank me. I haven't decided what I think of you yet." She began wrapping the fabric. "The hearing is in 10 days. I'll be there. What I say will depend on what I see between now and then." "That's fair," James said. "It's the only thing I offer." She pushed the wrapped package across the counter. "Do not disappoint me, Mr. Calloway." They walked back to the wagon in the pale afternoon. Clara fell into step beside James, which was not something she had done before. She generally kept the children between herself and him, a positioning habit that had its own eloquent logic. "She's going to help us," Clara said. "Maybe." "She made shoes the whole reason." Clara looked at him sideways. She saw the shoes, and that was enough. "People often lead with what they can see. The judge won't be able to see the shoes," Clara said. "Not the way she saw them. He'll just see paperwork." "He'll see you," James said. Clara was quiet for a few steps. "What if that's not enough? I'm 10. Holt is a grown man with a license and 20 years and a lawyer from Virginia City." "You're also the most honest person who's going to be in that room," James said. "That counts for something with the right judge." "And if Morrison isn't the right judge?" James didn't answer immediately, because he didn't believe in making promises he couldn't keep, and he couldn't promise that Morrison was the right judge. He had never met the man. "Then we find another way," he said. "You keep saying that." "Because I keep meaning it." Clara looked at him for a long moment, doing the same inventory she had been running since the auction, checking his face for the cracks that adults always eventually showed, the places where the performance of decency gave way to the reality of self-interest. She hadn't found them yet. She didn't know what to do with that. 4 days before the hearing, Victor Holt came to the ranch. He came in the late afternoon in a good coat with his lawyer and one other man, whose function was not immediately clear, but whose size suggested it was not clerical. They pulled up to the house in a covered buggy, and Holt climbed out with the bearing of a man paying a civil visit that he expected to conclude in his favor. James was in the barn when he heard the buggy. He came out and walked toward the house, and Holt met him in the yard with his hand extended and a smile that did not touch his eyes. "Mr. Calloway," Holt said, "I thought we should speak directly before this goes any further." James did not take the hand. "Speak." Holt let the hand drop without visible offense. Practiced. "I have no wish for this to become an adversarial proceeding. I'm sure you had good intentions. But those children are legal wards of my institution, and I have a responsibility to their welfare that supersedes any informal arrangement you may have." "You beat them," James said. Holt blinked. It was small, barely perceptible, but it was there. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean." "The girl has burn scars on her arm that Dr. Greer has documented and attributed to deliberate infliction. The older boy has bruising consistent with repeated physical punishment. The others were malnourished." James kept his voice level. "You know exactly what I mean. Children in institutional care sustain injuries," Holt said. "Falls accidents, ordinary childhood. The kind of accident that leaves a hand-shaped burn mark." Holt's lawyer stepped forward. "Mr. Calloway, these are serious accusations. If you intend to make them before Judge Morrison, my client will be forced to—" "Your client can do whatever he likes," James said. "So can I." He looked at Holt. Just looked at him the way a man looks at something he has fully assessed and found wanting in every respect. "Take your buggy and go back to town," James said. "Come back when there's a judge present. Until then, you're on my property without an invitation, and I'm asking you to leave." Something moved through Holt's expression. The composed surface of it cracked just slightly, just enough to show what was underneath. Not anger exactly. Something colder. The particular displeasure of a man who is accustomed to controlling outcomes, discovering that a variable has not cooperated. "You're making a mistake," Holt said. "Probably," James said. "I'll make it anyway." Holt held his gaze for 3 seconds, then turned and walked back to the buggy. His lawyer followed. The large man followed the lawyer. The buggy left. James stood in the yard until it was out of sight. Then he turned around and found all 5 children standing on the porch. He hadn't heard them come out. Clara was in front as always, and her face was doing something complicated. Something that was relief and fury and a kind of disbelieving hope, all compressed together into the expression of a 10-year-old girl who has spent 8 months waiting for the floor to give way and is slowly, reluctantly beginning to wonder if maybe it won't. "You told him to leave," Thomas said. "Yes." "He didn't argue?" "No." Thomas turned this over. "Why didn't he argue?" "Because arguing with me wasn't the point of coming," James said. "He came to see if I'd make a deal, to find out if I could be bought off or scared off." He climbed the porch steps. "I can't." Nora held up her slate. It read, "He'll be worse at the hearing now." "Yes," James said. "He will." Another line appeared below the first good. "Let him be worse. Then the judge will see it." James looked at her. "That's exactly right," he said. Nora lowered her slate, tucked it against her chest. And for the first time since James had known her, she looked something other than watchful. She looked briefly like a child who has placed a bet she thinks she might actually win. The night before the hearing, Clara could not sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to Abby breathing beside her and ran through it the way she ran through everything systematically from worst case to best case, accounting for every variable she could name. Worst case, Morrison ruled for Holt. They went back. The shoes were taken. The bread under the mattress was taken. The books Nora had been working through were taken. James Calloway went back to his 400 acres of silence, and they went back to a floor dormitory and a man who knew exactly how to make cruelty look like charity. She pressed that down. It was a real possibility. She had learned not to flinch from real possibilities. Best case, Morrison saw it clearly. Morrison was the right kind of judge. They stayed. She lay there and thought about James telling Holt to leave, about the way he had stood in the yard without raising his voice and without backing up even a fraction of an inch, about the fact that when Holt left, James had turned around, and the first thing he'd done was look to see if they were all right. That was the thing she kept returning to, every time. The first thing he did was look for them. She heard the door of the room across the hall open, and then quiet footsteps on the stairs. She waited a moment, then got up and followed. James was in the kitchen. He had Margaret's photograph in his hand. Clara had seen it before on the mantel. A woman with a direct gaze and a quality of warmth that came through even in the faded image. He was sitting with his elbows on the table and his head bent. He didn't hear her until she pulled out the chair across from him, and then he looked up. "Can't sleep," Clara said. It was not a question. "No," James said. She sat down. He set the photograph on the table between them face up, and they both looked at it. "She would have known what to say tomorrow," James said. "Margaret always knew what to say. I'm better with animals and fence posts. You knew what to say to Thomas about the bread." James was quiet. "And to Abby about the horse," Clara said. "And you didn't say anything to Eli, which was exactly right, because saying something would have been wrong." She folded her hands on the table. "You're better at this than you think you are." James looked at her across the table. This 10-year-old girl, who had been taking care of people since the world stopped providing anyone to take care of her, who had offered herself at an auction to save her sister without a moment's calculation, who had been watching him with those clear, honest eyes for 12 days, and had not yet found what she was looking for, and had not yet stopped looking. "Are you scared?" he asked. "Yes," Clara said immediately. "I'm always scared. Being scared isn't the problem. The problem is letting it make you stop." James looked at her for a long moment. "Your mother really was a good teacher," he said. Clara's throat moved. She was. They sat in the kitchen in the dark, not talking, the photograph of Margaret between them, and outside the Wyoming night pressed cold and indifferent against the windows. And in 12 hours, everything would be decided by a man neither of them had met, and there was nothing left to do to prepare for it, except sit with what was true and hope in the morning it would be enough. The courthouse in Harlow Creek was a wood-frame building that smelled of old paper and the particular cold that settles into structures that are heated only when they need to be. Judge Morrison had arrived the night before, which meant the town had spent the evening speculating in the way small towns do, quietly, thoroughly, and with the confidence of people who have already decided the outcome before the proceedings begin. James knew this because Helen Marsh told him when they arrived in the same direct way. She told him everything, which was without preamble and without apology. "Half the town thinks you're a fool," she said, falling into step beside him as they approached the courthouse steps. "The other half thinks you're something else. I haven't decided which half is right." "Which half are you leaning toward?" James asked. "Ask me in 2 hours," Helen said, and walked inside. They filed in together. James first, then Clara, then the others, in the order they had developed over the past 12 days, which was the order of how much each of them needed to be close to Clara, which was Eli pressed to her left side, Abby on her right, Thomas and Nora behind. It was not a formation anyone had planned. It had simply evolved the way things evolve when people have been frightened long enough that proximity becomes its own language. Holt was already seated on the left side of the room. His lawyer Caldwell sat beside him with a leather satchel and the composed expression of a man who has calculated the odds and found them favorable. Holt himself looked up when James entered, and his face did the same thing it had done in the yard. The surface held, but something beneath it registered the complication of James Calloway's continued failure to behave predictably. James seated the children on the right side bench and sat at the end nearest the aisle. Clara sat beside him. Eli sat beside Clara. Nobody spoke. Sheriff Hardin came in and took a position near the wall. Dr. Greer settled into the front row, his leather journal on his knee. Helen Marsh took a seat 3 rows back with the deliberateness of a woman staking a claim. At precisely 9 o'clock, Judge Morrison entered. He was older than James had expected, mid-60s, silver at the temples, with the kind of face that had been shaped over decades into an expression of careful neutrality. Not coldness. Neutrality. The face of a man who had learned that reaction was a luxury he couldn't afford in his profession. He moved to the bench, settled his robes, opened a folder, and looked at the room over the rim of his spectacles. "Case before this court," he said, his voice carrying the flat, precise tone of a man who had opened proceedings 10,000 times and intended to do it 10,000 more. Holt Home for Children versus James Calloway. Matter of custody of 5 minor children. He looked at Caldwell. "Plaintiff's counsel, you may proceed." Caldwell rose. He was smooth in the way that expensive legal training made men smooth, every gesture calibrated, every pause intentional. He laid out Holt's position in 8 minutes without a single wasted word. Licensed institution. Established protocols. A bill of sale that transferred labor rights, not guardianship. A single man who had bypassed 20 years of territorial child welfare procedure on an impulse. Mr. Calloway acted perhaps from good intentions, Caldwell said with the tone of a man granting a significant concession. But good intentions do not constitute legal authority. These children remain wards of Holt Home, and Mr. Holt has both the legal standing and the moral obligation to ensure their return. He sat. Judge Morrison looked at James. "Mr. Calloway, you have no legal counsel." "No, sir." "That's your right. It's also a significant disadvantage in these proceedings. Do you understand that?" "I understand it," James said. "I'm proceeding anyway." Morrison studied him for a moment. "Very well. Your opening." James stood. He was not a man who made speeches. He had thought about this on the ride into town, had considered and discarded half a dozen approaches, and had settled finally on the only one that felt honest. "Your Honor, I went to buy grain on January the 14th, he said. "I came home with 5 children. I did it because a 10-year-old girl offered herself at a public auction to save her 4-year-old sister, and I had not seen that kind of courage in a long time, and I was not willing to walk away from it." He paused. "I didn't follow proper channels. I know that. I'm asking this court to look at those 5 children and at the man who is claiming them and decide which one of us is actually acting in their interests." He sat down. Morrison wrote something. His expression gave away nothing. Caldwell called Holt first. Holt took the stand with the ease of a man entirely comfortable with public testimony, which was itself a kind of evidence, if you knew what to look for. He described Holt Home in terms that were accurate in the way that a map is accurate, technically correct in its details, while conveying nothing true about the territory. Regular meals, educational instruction, structured environment, 20 years of service to the territorial orphan welfare system, and the bill of sale from the January auction, Caldwell said. "Can you explain the nature of that transaction?" "Work placement," Holt said. "Standard practice for older children who are difficult to place through conventional adoption. We find households willing to provide room and board in exchange for light labor. It gives the children structure and useful skills. Not a sale of custody. Absolutely not. The children remain under the home's legal wardship. We maintain oversight responsibility." Caldwell nodded. "And when Mr. Calloway took the children without completing the proper paperwork?" "I was concerned," Holt said, and his voice carried exactly the right weight of responsible concern. "A single man unknown to us taking 5 children with no background verification, no home assessment, no territorial filing. My first obligation is to their safety." "Thank you," Caldwell said. "No further questions." Morrison looked at James. "Your witness, Mr. Calloway." James stood and looked at Holt for a moment before he spoke. Holt looked back with the patient expression of a man who has been cross-examined before and knows how to wait it out. "You said the children receive regular meals," James said. "They do. Daniel Foster is 12 years old. When I sat him down to breakfast on the morning of January 15th, he ate until he was physically unable to eat more, and then he cried." James let that land. "He told me he had never been full in his life. Is that consistent with regular meals?" "Boys that age are always hungry," Holt said smoothly. "They exaggerate. Clara Briggs has burn scars on her right arm. She says you held her arm against the stove. Do you dispute that?" I do categorically. If the girl has scars, they predate her time with me. The fire that killed her parents. The scars are hand-shaped, James said. Dr. Greer has documented them. He'll testify to the shape and origin in some detail if it's useful to the court. Holt's expression did not change, but the quality of his stillness shifted very slightly, very briefly, the way the surface of water changes when something moves underneath it. I don't know what the doctor believes he observed, Holt said. I can only speak to the conditions at my facility. Then speak to the floor dormitory, James said. 12 children in a space built for 8. Winter temperatures cold enough to see your breath indoors. The dormitory is adequately heated. Abby Carter is 4 years old. She was born with one leg shorter than the other, a condition her physician in Cheyenne noted was manageable with proper orthopedic support. James paused. In the 2 years she was in your care, did you provide that support? A fractional hesitation. Resources are limited in institutional. Did you provide it? James said. Not a question this time. No, Holt said. Holt, I made her shoes in my workshop, James said. It took me 3 evenings. She ran across my kitchen floor for the first time in her life 3 days later. He looked at the judge, then back at Holt. No further questions. Greer took the stand next and testified with the methodical precision of a man who has been keeping records for exactly this kind of moment. He read from his journal without editorializing, which made it more effective than editorializing would have been. Dates. Observations. Clinical terminology that translated in plain language to a pattern of injury and neglect that could not be attributed to childhood accidents without straining credulity past its breaking point. Caldwell challenged him on interpretation. Greer did not move. I've been practicing medicine for 25 years, Greer said. I know the difference between a fall and a hand. I know what chronic malnutrition looks like in a growing child. I know what it looks like when a child has been given adequate food for 2 weeks after a long period of not having it. These children showed all 3 of those things when I examined them, and my journal has 10 years of similar findings from other children who passed through Holt's care. He closed the journal. I should have done this sooner. I didn't have a case strong enough to justify the fight. I have one now. Helen Marsh testified with the brevity of a woman who had already said what she had to say privately, and saw no reason to elaborate. She had observed the children. She had observed James Calloway. She had observed specifically that a man with no cobbling experience had built a 4-year-old girl's shoes to correct a congenital condition that a licensed child care institution had ignored for 2 years. Her opinion, offered flatly and without decoration, was that the children were better off where they were. Caldwell tried to establish that 2 weeks was insufficient time to assess fitness. I've assessed men and women in this county for 37 years, Helen said. I don't need more time than it takes to see what a person does when they think no one's watching. Mr. Calloway made those shoes in his workshop at night. He wasn't performing for anyone. He was just doing it. She looked at Caldwell. Is that all? Then Morrison looked at Clara. Miss Briggs, he said, I'd like to hear from you if you're willing. Clara stood before James could say anything. She walked to the witness stand without looking at Holt, placed her hand on the Bible, and sat down with the posture of someone who has been carrying themselves upright by force of will for so long it has become the only way they know how to sit. Morrison leaned forward slightly. How old are you, Clara? 10, sir. I want you to tell me about your time at Holt Home, in your own words. Take as long as you need. Clara folded her hands in her lap. She looked at the judge, not at Holt, not at Caldwell, not at James, just at the judge with those clear, direct eyes that had been taking inventory of adults since she was old enough to understand that some of them could not be trusted. She told him about the dormitory floor, about the soup that was mostly water, about the way Holt moved through the facility on inspection days versus every other day, about the cellar where children who spoke out of turn were locked for periods that depended entirely on Holt's mood, about the night he had gripped her arm and held it against the stove and what she had said that made him do it, and the fact that she did not regret saying it. She pulled up her sleeve and showed the court the scars. The woman behind Helen Marsh made a sound. Caldwell said that a child's memory was unreliable, that trauma distorted perception, that Clara's obvious attachment to James Calloway colored everything she believed she remembered. Clara turned to look at him with an expression that was not angry. It was something quieter and more complete than anger. "I remember everything," she said. "I have remembered everything since I was 6 years old, because I learned very early that the only way to protect yourself is to remember exactly what happened and exactly who did it. My memory is not unreliable. It is the most reliable thing I own." Caldwell sat down. Morrison wrote for almost a full minute. The courtroom waited. Then the door at the back opened. Sheriff Hardin came in. He moved to the front of the room with the controlled urgency of a man trying not to cause a scene while carrying information that was going to cause one anyway. He leaned down beside Morrison and spoke quietly for 15 seconds. Morrison's expression did not change. He looked up. "We'll take a brief recess." James was on his feet. "What's happened?" Hardin straightened and looked at him. "The boy," he said. "Eli. He was in the hallway with my deputy during the testimony." Deputy turned around for a moment. He paused. "He's gone." The sound Clara made was not a word. It was something underneath words, something that came from a place that language hadn't reached yet. She was moving before anyone else had fully processed what Hardin had said, pushing past James toward the door. James caught her arm. "Clara, he took him." Her voice was shaking for the first time since James had known her. "Holt took him. He has people. He came to the ranch with men. He has people who do things for him. He took Eli to show us, to show the judge." "We don't know that." "I know it." She looked at James with eyes that were past the careful inventory, past the measured assessment, past every wall she had constructed in 8 months of surviving without anyone reliable. "I know it the same way I know everything, because I've watched him for 2 years, and I know how he thinks, and he took Eli because Eli can't call for help." James looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then he looked at Hardin. "Holt has a property north of town. Hunting cabin maybe 15 miles. "I know it," Hardin said. "That's where he'd go. Somewhere he controls, somewhere isolated close enough to retrieve the boy, but far enough that there are no witnesses." James was already moving. "I need my horse." "James." Hardin fell into step. "Let me bring men." "How long will that take?" 20 minutes to assemble. I'll go ahead. You follow." He stopped and turned back to Clara. Abby was beside her now. Abby's hand in hers, and Thomas stood just behind them both, and Nora had her slate pressed against her chest like armor. They looked at him, all 4 of them, with 4 different expressions that were all variations on the same thing, which was the expression of people who have learned not to believe that anyone is coming back and are trying against the full weight of that learning to believe it anyway. "I'm coming back," James said. "With him." Clara's chin moved once, the closest thing to trust she had ever given without demanding proof first. He rode hard. The winter air cut against his face and his horse worked through the snow with the focused effort of an animal that understood urgency. James rode and did not think about what he would find when he got there, because thinking about it was not useful. He thought instead about what Hardin had said, Holt's cabin 15 miles north, and about the tracks he was following 2 horses and a man on foot through fresh snow, the signs clear enough for someone who knew how to read them. He found the cabin in 40 minutes. There was smoke from the chimney, 2 horses tied outside, a covered buggy that he recognized from the yard of his ranch 4 days ago. He dismounted 100 yards out, tied his horse to a bare-limbed tree, and covered the remaining distance on foot, through the snow, moving to the side of the cabin, where a window gave him a view of the interior. 3 men inside. 2 he didn't recognize, hired men by the look of them, the practical, business-like kind that Holt apparently kept available for practical, business-like purposes. And Holt himself standing near the fireplace with the composed expression of a man who considers himself in control of the situation. In the corner on a wooden chair sat Eli. His hands were not tied. Holt was not stupid enough to tie a child's hands when a judge might eventually need to be persuaded that nothing improper had occurred. But Eli sat with the stillness of a child who understood exactly what kind of room he was in, and had made himself as small and motionless as possible, because small and motionless things were sometimes overlooked. His eyes were open. He was not hurt. He was terrified in the specific, experienced way of a child who has been frightened many times before and has developed a protocol for surviving it. James tried the door. Unlocked. He opened it and walked in, and the two hired men turned, and one of them reached for his weapon, and James shot him in the shoulder before the gun cleared leather. One shot measured, placed with the precision of a man who had been shooting since he was 12 years old, and who had aimed in this instance for the least damaging possible target. The man went down. The second man raised his hands. Holt stood very still. "The boy," James said. "Right now." Holt did not move immediately. He looked at James with the expression of a man calculating even now what leverage remained available to him. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "this is not what it appears." "I know exactly what it is." James's voice was flat. "Step away from the child. I am his legal guardian. I have every right." "You have 30 seconds," James said. Then I stopped being patient. Something in his face or his voice or the absolute absence of anything, in either that suggested he was performing rather than stating fact, communicated itself to Holt with a clarity that years of practice at reading people had not prepared him for. Because Holt was accustomed to men who threatened consequences, they had carefully calculated not to follow through on. And James Calloway was not that kind of man. Holt stepped away from the chair. Eli was across the room before anyone moved again off the chair, crossing the floor in 6 steps, and James crouched to meet him, and Eli hit him in the chest with enough force that James rocked back on one knee in the snow near the door where he dropped to receive the boy's weight. Eli's arms went around his neck and locked, and then against James's shoulder, in a voice that was rough from 7 months of disuse and barely audible above the sound of the wind coming through the open door, Eli said a word. One word. The word that Eli Briggs had stored inside himself through a farmhouse fire and 8 months of an institution and 12 days of learning whether the world contained after all one adult who could be trusted with the thing he had left. "Papa." James stopped breathing. The hired man with the raised hands stared at the floor. The one on the ground had stopped moving. Holt stood against the wall, and his face had gone the color of old ash. James held the boy. He held him with the care of a man holding something he had not expected to be given and was not going to let go of, and he said against the top of Eli's head, in a voice that was not entirely steady, "I'm here. I've got you. You're safe." Eli's grip did not loosen. "Can you say it again?" James said. Eli's voice came stronger this time, still rough, still finding itself, but certain in the way that some things are certain when they have been held too long in the dark and have finally found the light. "Papa," Eli said, "don't leave me." "I'm not leaving," James said. "I promise you, I am not leaving." He heard horses outside Hardin and his men arriving with the timing of people who are always slightly too late for the moment that mattered, but exactly on time for everything that follows. The door opened wider. Cold air moved through the cabin. James stood Eli still in his arms and looked at Holt. Victor Holt had spent 20 years building something that looked from the outside like charity. He had been good at it, good enough that people had looked away from the things that didn't quite fit, good enough that a county sheriff had seen the clean dormitory and asked no further questions, good enough that the territory kept sending him children and money. He did not look good at it now. He looked like what he was, which was a man who had run out of positions. "Victor Holt," Hardin said from the doorway, "you're under arrest for kidnapping and obstruction of a court proceeding. Put your hands where I can see them." Holt put his hands up. His lawyer was going to have a long, expensive, and ultimately unsuccessful several months ahead of him. The investigation into Holt home that Greer had been waiting 10 years to justify was going to begin before the week was out. The children in that facility were going to be accounted for one by one, and their stories were going to be heard. None of that was James's concern in this moment. His concern was the boy in his arms and the 4 children waiting in a courthouse 12 miles south, and the ride back through the cold that he was going to make as fast as his horse could manage, because Clara had been waiting long enough. He carried Eli to his horse and settled the boy in front of him in the saddle and wrapped his coat around them both against the wind, and they rode back toward Harlow Creek under a sky that had gone the color of pewter, with the particular quality of winter light that comes in the hour before sunset. Eli did not speak again during the ride. He had said what needed saying. The rest could wait. But once halfway back, he tilted his head up and looked at the sky, and James, following his gaze, saw nothing except clouds and cold and the last pale light of the afternoon. "What do you see?" James said. Eli pointed up. His finger traced something in the gray, a shape or a direction, or something James could not quite follow. Then the boy pressed his head back against James's chest, tucked his chin down, and was still. James kept riding. The courthouse was still lit when they arrived. Clara came through the door before James had fully dismounted, and she crossed the distance between the steps and the horse at a speed that her composure could not keep up with. And when she reached Eli, she pulled him out of James's arms and held him with the specific ferocity of someone who has spent 7 months being the only reliable thing in a 6-year-old's life and has not yet figured out how to stop. "I've got you," she said. "I've got you, I've got you, I've got you." Eli let himself be held. Over her shoulder, he looked at James. "He said something," James told her quietly. Clara went very still. "He spoke," James said. She pulled back and looked at her brother's face. Eli looked back at her with those eyes that held everything he had never been able to say. And then he said the word again, the one he had been keeping. "Papa," Eli said. He pointed at James. "Papa." Clara's breath came out in a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a sob, but lived in the territory between them. She pressed her forehead against her brother's and held on. Thomas stood on the courthouse steps. He had his arms crossed and his jaw set in the way he had that was not anger anymore, but something closer to a man who has been braced for impact for so long that he does not know how to unbrace and is starting to learn. He looked at James. "You found him." "I found him. You said you would." "Yes," James said. "I did." Thomas stood there for a moment with all of that, with the fact of a promise made and kept, which was a thing he had no existing category for. And then he walked down the steps and stood beside James, not touching, not speaking, just standing in the same space, which was the closest Thomas Foster had come to trust in 4 years. Judge Morrison appeared in the courthouse doorway. He looked at the group assembled in the cold: James, Clara, Eli, Thomas, Abby, Nora, Sheriff Hardin, Helen Marsh, who had come out to see what the commotion was, and he took in what was in front of him with the careful eyes of a man whose profession required him to see past what people said to what they actually were. He looked for a long time. Then he said, "Court will reconvene in the morning, but I think we all know where this is going." He looked at James. "Take your children home, Mr. Calloway. They've had enough for one day." James looked at the 5 of them. His children in every way that the word had ever meant anything. They slept that night like people who had been underwater and had finally broken the surface deeply, completely, with the particular exhaustion of bodies that have held tension so long they have forgotten what the absence of it feels like. James did not sleep. He sat by the fire with Margaret's photograph and a cup of coffee that went cold before he drank half of it, and he listened to the sounds of the house. The creak of the floorboards, settling the wind against the windows. The quiet breathing of 5 children distributed across 2 rooms upstairs. And he thought about what Morrison had said on the courthouse steps. "Take your children home." Not the children. Your children. He did not know if the judge had said it deliberately or if it had simply been the word that fit. He knew that it fit. He had known it was going to fit since the moment he set down his coffee cup in the crowd at Harlow Creek and started walking forward, though he had not had the language for it then. He had the language for it now. In the morning, he made breakfast without burning anything for the first time since Clara had corrected his damper technique, and the children came downstairs one by one in the order that had become as familiar to him as the order of chores or the sequence of seasons. Thomas first, then Nora, then Abby, moving carefully on the stairs with one hand on the wall, then Clara with Eli beside her, his small hand in hers. Eli sat at the table and ate. He did not speak during breakfast. But twice he looked at James with those dark, serious eyes, and once, when James refilled his cup from the coffee pot and passed close to where Eli sat, the boy reached out and touched his arm. Just once. Just briefly. The way you touch something to confirm that it's real. James put his hand over the boy's for a moment and then moved on because Eli did not need a production made of it. He just needed it acknowledged. "What time does the court start?" Thomas said. 9 o'clock, James said. Thomas ate. He did not say anything else about it, but he ate with the deliberate steadiness of a man fueling up for something that requires stamina. And when he cleared his plate, he sat back and looked at the ceiling, the way he did when he was thinking past the thing directly in front of him to the larger shape of it. "If Morrison rules against us," Thomas said, "what do we actually do?" "Thomas," Clara said. "No, I want to know. Not what Calloway plans to tell the judge. What we actually do if it goes wrong." James looked at him across the table. "We appeal to the territorial governor. I've already written the letter. It's in my coat." Thomas blinked. "You already wrote it?" "Last night, while you were sleeping." A pause. "What does it say?" "It says that a licensed institution has been operating as a labor trafficking scheme for 20 years under the protection of a county inspection process that Holt controlled, that Dr. Greer has a decade of medical documentation to support that claim, and that 5 children who have been demonstrably thriving in private care are being returned to that institution by a legal system that is prioritizing paperwork over the welfare of minors." James picked up his coffee. "It's 4 pages. Thomas stared at him. "You wrote 4 pages last night?" "I had things to say." Thomas looked at the table. Something worked through his face, slow and resistant, like ground thawing in early spring. "And if the governor doesn't act, then I take it to the federal circuit. And if the federal circuit is slow, I take the children and I go somewhere Holt's lawyers haven't established relationships, and I start the legal process over in a new territory." James set down his cup. "I told you I would find another way. I have a list of ways. We are not at the end of the list." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Nobody's ever had a list before." "What do you mean?" "Every adult who ever said they'd figure something out, they had one idea, maybe 2. When those didn't work, they stopped." He looked at James with the eyes of a boy who has been let down so many times that recognizing something different feels like a kind of vertigo. "You have a list." "I have a list," James confirmed. Thomas nodded once, a small motion, but it carried the full weight of a 12-year-old boy deciding something he would not walk back from. He picked up his fork and finished the last of his breakfast, and the subject was closed, because Thomas Foster was not a person who needed to say the same important thing twice. They rode to town in the wagon, the same way they had ridden the day before, and the day before James had brought them to Harlow Creek for the first time. The familiarity of it was its own quiet statement, that this was a route they knew that they had made it enough times to have learned its rhythms, that they were people who belonged to a place and were traveling from it and would return to it. Nora wrote something on her slate during the ride and held it up so Clara could read it. Clara read it and looked at Nora and nodded. James, watching from the driver's bench, did not ask what it said. He had learned that Nora shared what she chose to share when she was ready, and that patience was the only appropriate response. Nora caught him not asking and wrote something else and held the slate toward him. It read, "Thank you for not asking." "You're welcome," James said. She turned the slate around and wrote on the other side and held it up again. This side read, "I'll talk someday. I'm not ready yet, but someday." "I'll be here," James said. Nora put the slate in her lap and looked at the passing terrain with the expression of someone who has reached a private conclusion and is at peace with it. The courthouse was fuller than the day before. Word had traveled the way word travels in small towns, not through any single channel, but through all of them simultaneously, and people had come who had not been there yesterday. Some of them James recognized. Most he didn't. They filled the benches with the shuffling, whispering presence of a community that has belatedly realized it has a stake in something and has come to watch the outcome. Holt was not present. His lawyer was seated alone at the plaintiff's table with the satchel and the composed expression, though the composure had acquired a quality it hadn't had yesterday, the quality of a performance that the performer is no longer entirely convinced by. Hardin had told James that morning when they arrived that Holt was in custody, pending a bail hearing. That the investigation into Holt home had begun. That 2 other children from the facility had already been interviewed by the county doctor, and that the findings were consistent with everything Greer had documented. Caldwell rose when Morrison entered and made the best argument available to him, which was that his client's legal claim to wardship of the 5 children remained valid, regardless of any criminal investigation, that the 2 matters were procedurally separate, and that the court should not allow the circumstances of the previous day to prejudice a straightforward custody determination. Morrison listened to all of it without interruption. Then he said, "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell," in the tone of a man who has heard the argument and found it insufficient, and turned to James. James stood. James. He looked at the 5 children sitting in the front row. Thomas, with his arms crossed and his jaw set. Nora with her slate. Abby with her shoes. Clara with Eli's hand in both of hers. He looked at them the way he had looked at them that first morning, when they climbed out of the wagon and stood in front of his house, and waited to find out what kind of place they had been brought to. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor," he said, "I don't have anything to add to what was said yesterday. The children are fed, clothed, and healthy. Dr. Greer has documented what they were before and what they are now. Mrs. Marsh has testified to what she's seen. The children have spoken for themselves." He paused. "I'd like Clara Briggs to say one more thing if the court will allow it." Morrison looked at Clara. "Miss Briggs." Clara stood without hesitation and walked to the front of the room, and this time she did not go to the witness stand. She stood in the open space between the benches and the judge's platform and looked at Morrison directly. "I have one thing to say," she said. "Yesterday I told you what Holt home was. I want to tell you what Mr. Calloway's ranch is so you can compare them." Morrison nodded. "Go ahead." "At Holt home, my brother didn't speak for 7 months. He stopped talking the night our parents died, and nobody at that facility tried to find out why or what he needed. He was called defective. He was considered a problem." Clara's voice was steady. "At Mr. Calloway's ranch, my brother sat next to him for an hour in the evening while he worked, and Mr. Calloway talked out loud about what he was doing without requiring Eli to respond, because he understood that what Eli needed was to be in the presence of an adult who wasn't demanding anything from him." She stopped. "Yesterday, when Mr. Calloway came to get him from that cabin, my brother spoke for the first time in 7 months. He said one word." She looked at James. "He said Papa." The courtroom was silent. "I've been watching Mr. Calloway for 2 weeks," Clara continued, "because I have learned that watching is the only reliable way to know what a person actually is. I watched him make shoes for my sister in the middle of the night when nobody was looking. I watched him not punish Thomas for hiding bread under his mattress. I watched him wait for Eli instead of pushing him. I watched him ride out alone to get my brother back from men he had no guarantee he could manage." She looked at the judge. "He doesn't do any of it because he's trying to prove something. He does it because that's who he is. And I'm 10 years old, and I have not had many opportunities to say this about an adult, but I trust him. I trust him completely, and I am asking you to let us stay." She walked back to her seat. Eli, when she sat down, put his head against her shoulder and closed his eyes. Morrison removed his spectacles. He cleaned them with the deliberate care of a man who uses the time to think, then replaced them and looked at the room. "I've been on this circuit for 19 years, he said. "I've ruled on custody matters that were clear, and matters that were complicated, and matters where the law pointed one direction and justice pointed another, and I've had to decide which of those 2 things I was actually serving." He looked at Caldwell. "The legal argument for Mr. Holt's wardship claim is technically sound. The bill of sale is ambiguous. The territorial filing was not completed. These are real procedural deficiencies." Caldwell began to rise. "I'm not finished," Morrison said. Caldwell sat. "The law exists to protect people," Morrison continued. "Specifically in matters of child welfare, it exists to protect children. When the application of procedural law results in the return of children to a facility where they were demonstrably neglected and abused, I am not serving the law's purpose. I am using its mechanism against its intention." He closed the folder in front of him. "I will not do that." He picked up his gavel. "In the matter of Holt Home versus James Calloway, I find as follows. The bill of sale from the January 14th auction is hereby declared void as an instrument of unlawful child labor, trafficking prohibited under both territorial statute and federal law. Victor Holt's license to operate a child care facility is suspended, pending the outcome of the criminal investigation currently being conducted by Sheriff Hardin's office. And regarding the custody of Clara Briggs, Eli Briggs, Thomas Foster, Abby Carter, and Nora Ellis, it is the finding of this court that these children are thriving in Mr. Calloway's care, and that their best interests are served by remaining in that care. I am granting James Calloway full temporary custody, effective immediately, with a clear path to permanent adoption, to be completed within 90 days upon proper filing." The gavel came down. The sound it made was clean and final, the sound of a door closing on one thing and opening on another. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Abby said, in a voice entirely too loud for the setting, "Does that mean we can stay?" Helen Marsh laughed from 3 rows back. A real laugh, short and genuine, the kind that escapes before a person decides whether to allow it. "Yes," James said. "That means we can stay." Abby stood up on the bench and put her arms around his neck, and he caught her without thinking about it, the way you catch things that belong to you. And she held on with both arms and both legs, and her face pressed into his shoulder. And he held her back with one arm, and with the other he reached out and his hand found the top of Eli's head. And Eli leaned into it, the way a child leans into the hand of a person he has decided is safe. Thomas stood. He did not hug James. He was not there yet, and James knew it and did not ask for it. Instead, Thomas put out his hand, the formal hand of a 12-year-old boy who is managing the largest feeling of his life by channeling it into the most dignified gesture available to him. James shook it, seriously as between equals. "All right," Thomas said. His voice was not entirely steady. "All right." Nora held up her slate. It had one word on it in the largest letters she could fit. Home. James looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Clara. She was watching him with those clear, honest eyes that had been taking inventory of him for 2 weeks and had finally definitively finished the count and arrived at a number they could both live with. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She put her hand in his. They walked out of the courthouse together into January light that was thin and pale and cold, and the town of Harlow Creek watched them go, this man and these 5 children, who had no business being a family and had become one anyway. The way things that are necessary sometimes become real, simply by virtue of being needed enough. Hardin shook James's hand on the steps. Greer nodded once, the nod of a man who has done what he set out to do and has no need to discuss it further. Helen Marsh stopped beside them on her way down the steps and looked at the children one at a time in her assessing way, and then looked at James. "Don't get comfortable," she said. "Raising children is the longest project there is." "I know," James said. "You'll make mistakes." "I expect so. They'll forgive you if you're honest about them." "Yes, ma'am." Helen looked at him for one more moment. Then she adjusted her coat against the cold and walked away, and James had the distinct impression that she had said everything she intended to say on the subject and would not be bringing it up again. The ride home was different from every other ride they had made. It was the same wagon, the same road, the same pale winter sky pressing down on the same flat Wyoming terrain. But the quality of the silence was different, not the silence of people waiting to find out what would happen, but the silence of people who know and are sitting with the knowledge and finding it larger than language. Halfway home, Eli spoke again. He had been sitting in the wagon bed with Abby, who had fallen asleep against his side in the way she always did when warmth and exhaustion converged, and he looked up at the sky, the same way he had looked at it on the ride back from the cabin the night before. Then he looked at James on the driver's bench. "She's watching," Eli said. His voice was still finding itself rough-edged, unpracticed, but increasingly certain. James turned to look at him. "Who is?" James said. Eli pointed at the sky. "You're Margaret." He pointed at the sky again in a slightly different direction. "Our mama." He looked at James with the seriousness of a 6-year-old conveying information he considers important. "They're friends. They fix this." James looked at the sky. The clouds were the color of old pewter, and the light coming through them was thin and cold, and even the kind of light that shows everything clearly without softening any of it. "You think so?" James said. Eli nodded once with the conviction of someone stating a fact. James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think you might be right." Eli put his head down against Abby's hair and closed his eyes, and the wagon rolled on through the snow, and Clara, sitting beside James on the driver's bench, looked at him sideways. "Do you believe that?" she said. What he said. James thought about the photograph on the table the night before the hearing. He thought about Margaret saying someday James will fill this house. He thought about the particular sequence of an ordinary morning going to town to buy grain that had somehow ended with 5 children in his wagon and a life he had not been living suddenly requiring him to live it. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I don't not believe it." Clara considered this. "That's a strange thing to believe." "Yes," James said, "it is." She was quiet for a moment. "Mama used to say that the people who love us don't really leave. She said love doesn't have anywhere to go, so it stays." She looked at her hands in her lap. "I stopped believing that after the fire. It seemed like something people said to make grief easier." And now, Clara turned and looked back at her siblings. Eli sleeping against Abby Thomas, sitting with his arms resting on his knees and his face turned toward the horizon. Nora reading the last of the books from James's shelves with her finger tracing each line. She looked at them for a long time. "Now I think maybe it's not something people say to make grief easier," she said. "Maybe it's just true." The ranch came into view as the afternoon light began to fade. The house, the barn smoke still rising faintly from the chimney where James had banked the fire that morning. The fences. The fields under snow. The oak tree at the edge of the property where Margaret's grave sat quiet under its winter covering. James pulled the wagon to a stop. The children climbed down the way they always did. Thomas first, then Nora, then Abby, waking up and reaching for someone's hand, then Eli, then Clara, last jumping down and landing in the snow, and turning to look at the house with those clear eyes that had been watching and measuring and cataloging for 2 weeks, and were now doing something different. Not measuring, just seeing. "Go inside," James said. "I'll be there in a minute." They went in. Thomas held the door. Abby went through first, then Nora, then Eli, then Thomas himself, and the door closed behind them, and James stood in the yard in the cold and looked at the oak tree. He walked to it. He stood at Margaret's grave with his hands at his sides and the cold working through his coat, and he was quiet for a long time, the way you are quiet with someone you know well enough to sit with in silence. Then he said, "I filled the house." The wind moved through the bare branches above him. "5 of them," he said. "You would have known exactly what to do with each one. You always knew." He paused. "I'm figuring it out as I go, but I think that might be all right. I think they've had enough of adults who were certain about the wrong things." He stood a moment more. "I'm going to be all right," he said. "I think we all are." He walked back to the house. Inside, Thomas had stoked the fire without being asked. Nora was on the floor with her book. Abby was talking to June through the window in the direction of the barn in the patient, one-sided way she had developed, as though the horse could hear her through glass and distance if she simply spoke clearly enough. Eli sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil drawing something with the focused attention of a child who once asked questions about everything and has found again the means to ask them. Clara was at the stove. She looked up when James came in. I thought I'd start supper, she said. You don't have to do that, James said. I know. She turned back to the pot. I want to. He hung his coat. He sat at the table near Eli and looked at what the boy was drawing, 6 figures, rough and earnest, standing in front of a house. 5 small ones and 1 large one. Above them in the sky, 2 figures rendered in the soft, unpracticed lines of a child's hand watching from the clouds. Is that us? James said. Eli looked at his drawing, looked at James, nodded. And those 2 up there? Eli pointed at the 2 figures in the clouds. Then he pointed at Margaret's photograph on the mantel. Then he pointed in the direction of the window and the fields, and somewhere beyond them, the way children point at things adults have stopped being able to see. James looked at the drawing for a long time. It's beautiful, he said. Thank you. Eli smiled. It was the same smile he'd given in the cabin, small and new, and finding its shape a thing that had been locked away for 7 months and was learning again how to exist in the world. James Calloway looked at that smile, and at the kitchen full of children, and at the fire Thomas had built, and at Clara at the stove, and at the life that had assembled itself around him in 2 weeks out of $50 and one 10-year-old girl's act of impossible courage. And he understood something he had not understood on the morning he rode to town to buy grain. He had not been waiting for nothing. He had been waiting for this, for these 5 specific people, for this particular kitchen, for the weight of a child's trust earned slowly and kept carefully, for the sound of a boy's voice speaking the word Papa. For the first time in 7 months, for a daughter who checked on her siblings twice every night and was learning slowly that she did not have to do it alone. He had been waiting for a reason to be the person Margaret always believed he was. He had found 5 of them, and that when everything else was said and done, and the law had spoken, and the fire was warm and supper was on the stove, was the only thing that had ever mattered. That broken people had found each other in the cold and had chosen to stay. And in the choosing had built something none of them could have built alone. Something real. Something permanent. Something that no auction, no lawyer, no judge who read only the paperwork and never the people could take apart. A family. Theirs.